Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the second FSR Talk in 2024 that forms part of the FSR Talk series. My name is Carol Lofafa, a research associate at the African School of Regulation. So the FSR Talk series is a monthly platform that convenes policymakers and academics to engage in discussions on pertinent issues concerning energy and climate regulation. Designed for a global audience, these talks facilitate knowledge, exchange, and collaboration to address the challenges of transitioning towards sustainable energy and combating climate change. Each session focuses on a specific theme or topic relevant to energy and climate solutions, providing insights from experts in the field. Today, the topic revolves around the United Nations Environmental Programme, UNEP's efforts concerning the Loss and Damage Fund, which addresses the impact of climate change that cannot be mitigated or adapted to, resulting in irreversible losses and damages. The event today will highlight UNEP's significant role in advocating for and operationalizing mechanisms to address these challenges. Additionally, it will discuss a landmark decision made at the most recent COP, emphasizing the global community's commitment to tackling loss and damage associated with climate change. So today we are joined by Dr. Alvin Chandra. Dr. Alvin is the Global Coordinator for Adaptation Policy and Partnerships at UNEP. He will serve as the speaker for this session. With oversight of the Global Adaptation Network, Dr. Chandra brings expertise in climate adaptation strategies and policies. Our main discussant today, Professor Ginevra Lemoli, is a part-time professor at the European University Institute at the Robert Schuman Center, and also will offer critical analysis and commentary on the topics discussed. The event will be co-hosted by myself, as well as Dr. Lucila de Almeida, a part-time professor at the EUI as well. Welcome today, and I will hand over the floor to Alvin for your presentation.
Thank you for that warm welcome. Thank you for that warm welcome, and also for the FSR Secretariat to give us an opportunity to speak about the Adaptation Gap Report. I will speak, the key findings of the Adaptation Gap Report from 2023. And then transition into what was a key feature of the Adaptation Gap Report, a focus on loss and damage. So the Adaptation Gap Report 2023, Underfinanced, Underprepared, provides us quite significant updates on the state of adaptation finance, planning, and implementation. So we do know that in the context of growing climate risks, the Adaptation Gap Reports do provide science-based assessments of the global progress, and this helps to inform action on climate change, also policy, science, knowledge, and programming. If we can please transition to the next slide, please. So for this report, UNEP had convened 54 authors, of which about 45% were from developing countries. Over half were females. The production of the report was seen by an international steering committee, and it did benefit from multiple rounds of external expert review. So besides describing the progress on adaptation planning and implementation, last year's report had undertaken a major adaptation finance update. It also focused on loss and damage. The next slide, please. So we do know that climate adaptation progress is slowing down as climate impacts intensify. We do know from IPCC, but also from our own observations, a range of climate extremes are increasing in intensity, in frequency. So, for example, 2023 was the warmest year on record. We witnessed record heat in Chile causing deadly wildfires. We saw extreme heat and wildfires in Canada, the US, and the continuation of a multi-year drought in East Africa, amongst others, where I'm based. So 2024 also began with very unprecedented events, for example, floods and also cyclones in Australia. So the evidence is fairly clear that climate impacts are rising, they're increasing, translating into soft and hard limits of adaptation, some of which may have already reached, resulting in increasing losses and damage, particularly in the most vulnerable communities. So to protect vulnerable communities and populations and avoiding increasing losses and damage, we must urgently ramp up adaptation efforts alongside rapid cuts to greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm speaking on behalf of on the margins of UN Environment Assembly 6. Climate change, along with biodiversity and pollution, is a key issue that member states are discussing. The Adaptation Gap Report in 2023 shows why adaptation is slowing on all fronts when it should actually be accelerating and catching up with climate impacts. So basically, we find that adaptation is slowing in terms of financing, in terms of planning, and also in implementation. Can we please move to the next slide? So as you see on this slide, and this is an abstract from the Adaptation Gap Report, adaptation planning and implementation are plateauing. And if you look at the upper figure, the progress in adaptation planning is plateauing. 5 out of 6 countries now have some form of national adaptation planning instrument. Progress to reach full global coverage is slowing, and this is where greater support is required. So 85% of countries have at least some form of national adaptation planning instruments. But on the other hand, over half of the countries have 2 or more national level instruments, and their quality is improving in terms of adequacy and effectiveness, and this is a positive signal. Now, if you look at the lower figure, this shows that while projects are getting bigger, so not just adaptation projects, but mainstream projects as well, the number of adaptation actions supported through the 4 international climate funds has stagnant for the past decade. And this is quite a worrying trend for us. The report also finds that gender and social inclusion is poorly addressed and funded in adaptation actions, despite showing better results. Since adaptation implementation in developing countries largely depends on external financial support, the failure to enhance the number of adaptation actions will increase the implementation gaps. And this is also quite a bit of a worry because many developing countries are at the brunt of climate impacts. Can we move to the next slide, please? So on this slide, what I would like to show is basically how adaptation finance needs of developing countries are changing. So when we look at the financial needs of developing countries, they're 10 to 18 times current. They're 10 to 18 times of current international public finance flows. So what I mean by this is that the Adaptation Gap Report, when we look at the financial needs, they have in fact, the gap or the finance gap has actually increased. The adaptation finance gap now we're looking at about a range of US 194 to 366 billion per year. And if you'd like to know more in terms of how the financial needs have changed, there's an in-depth chapter in the Adaptation Gap Report that kind of breaks this down. If you look at the figure that's on the slide, it models adaptation cost in this decade, and it's roughly around 250 billion per year. And adaptation costs are expected to significantly rise by 2050. In contrast, international public adaptation finance flows to developing countries have declined by 15% from the 2022 levels to about 21 billion in 2021. As a result of increasing climate impacts and growing needs and flattering flows of climate finance, the current adaptation finance gap is now in the range of 194 to 366 billion. Adaptation finance needs are about 10 to 18 times as great as the international public finance flows, so much higher than what we had previously estimated. What we also find is that doubling of the 2019 adaptation finance flow by 2025 to about 40 billion US per year, as urged in the Glasgow Climate Pact, is therefore much more urgent than ever. But on its own, even that this can only narrow down the financial gap by 5 to 10% in terms of the doubling of adaptation finance. Can we move to the next slide, please? So the next, in this slide, we basically talk about, and what the Adaptation Gap Report talks about is how we can leverage and deliver finance. Effective adaptation significantly reduces climate risks, and we know that it's from a development perspective, it's a really good value for money. So, for example, studies indicate that every billion that is invested in adaptation against coastal flooding leads to about 14 billion in reduced economic damages. So this is good investment. Similarly, about 16 billion US when invested in agriculture sector every year can prevent about 78 million people from starvation or chronic hunger. But for this to happen, we need to find innovative ways of delivering and channeling climate finance. And as we see on this slide, the report identifies 7 ways to increase adaptation finance. I'm not going to talk about all 7, but one of the key things that I would like to highlight is that the beyond public sector finance, private sector investment in adaptation is needed. We need to find a way to channel private sector finance, but also broadening our partnership where some of the market imperfections can be corrected as well. And by that, I mean positive externalities, imperfect financial markets, and also incomplete information as well for private sector to engage. Also, in line with this and what the loss and damage community has been talking about is a reform of the global financial architecture. So much of the work that the Bridgetown Initiative, the Mia Motley Initiative are aiming for. For instance, the Bridgetown Initiative, it holds vast potential to support developing countries in boosting their resilience against future climate shocks. Can we move to the next slide? And I've just got 2 more slides to go before we can embark into discussion. So as I mentioned, a key feature of the 2023 Adaptation Gap Report was on loss and damage. Now, as a result of the COP27 decision in Sharm el-Sheikh to establish a new fund and funding arrangements, the 2023 report focused on loss and damage, and quite happy to report that of course, at COP28, landmark decision was reached in terms of operationalizing the new loss and damage fund and funding arrangements. But in the context of what the report found in 2023, of the 55 most climate vulnerable economies, they've already experienced losses and damage of more than 500 billion in the last 2 decades. So the scale of financing that is needed to be mobilized with the new fund has to be scaled up in terms of ambition. Now, these costs will, of course, rise steeply in the coming decades, particularly in the absence of strong mitigation and adaptation action. So if we look at the continuum of responses, mitigation is definitely needed so that adaptation costs and gaps are reduced. More adaptation and more mitigation would mean less losses and damages in future. And as you can see on this slide, the report identifies multiple ways of addressing the residual risks of climate risks before, during, and after climate events, both including economic and non-economic losses. So the type of actions that we're looking at in terms of addressing loss and damage includes disaster risk management, assessment of losses and damages, capacity building, early warning systems, protection of rights and particularly cultural identity, early warning systems, insurance, compensation, social protection measures, support to rebuilding livelihoods, forecast-based financing. And these reflect some of the solutions that the GAP report finds out. But of course, there are many uncertainties around the financial needs to address loss and damage, and the new loss and damage fund and funding arrangement will be quite important in terms of mobilizing resources. But in addition to this, finding innovative funding sources to reach out to the most vulnerable. If we move to the next slide, please. What I would say is that the new funding arrangement must help insulate poor and vulnerable from climate impacts. There are clear signals from the GAP report, from IPCC and WMO State of Report that worldwide adaptation is slowing when it should be accelerating. First, adaptation finance gap, as we find from the report, is widening and is much greater than what we had previously estimated at UNEP. Second, the progress in adaptation planning and implementation is plateauing rather than showing the urgency that is needed to accelerate. And third, without strong investment in mitigation and adaptation worldwide, losses and damage will rise steeply over the coming decades, particularly for the most vulnerable communities. And this is a constraint in the next generation from shaping a very livable future. So the Loss and Damage Fund must fully commit to low-income countries and disadvantaged vulnerable groups such as women and Indigenous people from climate impacts. I'll stop over there and happy to take on any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Chandra. I'll now jump in and, well, first, thank you for, again, being with us today, for your very insightful presentation, also for providing us with an overview of the Adaptation Gap Report and the Loss and Damage Fund, with pointing out the crucial aspects of both. So I have a few questions for you. I would like to start with a couple of questions related to the Adaptation Gap Report. And the first one really relates to the connection between, on one side, the current state of adaptation to climate change and the time factor. So you mentioned the updated cost of adaptation for developing countries that are in the range between $200 and $390 billion, and also the adaptation finance needs that are really for developing countries are 10 to 18 times as great as international public finance flows. So how does this estimate of adaptation finance really can be aligned with the time factor, namely the need to accelerate action, given that we are now in a critical decade? You refer to also some measures that can lead to better results. So what are the priorities in your view among these measures? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. I think the key message over here is that we need to invest in adaptation and mitigation now so that it will minimize the climate costs in future. Almost every year with the new iteration of the Adaptation Gap Report, we find that in light of slowing adaptation responses and public finance flows, what's happening is that the gap estimates are now increasing, also as a result of increasing climate finance. So what needs to happen now is that ambitious adaptation should be invested in, and this will help boost the resilience, and particularly for low-income countries and disadvantaged groups, including women. So this is quite important. The second thing that I should mention, and we talked about in this year's GAP report, is that the traditional modality of funds transferring adaptation finance, it's there, yes, but we need to find innovative ways to deliver finance to increase adaptation efforts. So, for example, anticipatory adaptation finance in terms of private sector finance, and these additional avenues like remittances, for example, can help accelerate increased finance through domestic expenditure and international and private sector finance. So that really is, and the COP28 has set a new momentum on loss and damage, on adaptation, and it's important that we maintain this momentum following COP28 in terms of fully committing to accelerating adaptation.
Thank you. You mentioned the importance of low-income countries and vulnerable countries. Also in the report, as you, I'm asking just to understand a bit also how this is taken into account in the report itself. In climate change debate, we talk a lot about equity, and in particular the distinction between intergenerational equity and intragenerational equity. And when we talk about intergenerational equity, is really who will carry the burden, so this generation or the future one. And when we talk about intrageneration, instead is really who within a generation will do it. And this is an issue of both among countries and within countries. So within countries, there is the discussion of, and also the just transition mechanism, for instance, that has been set in place. So there are certain solutions also at the regional and domestic level that have been developed. So I wonder to what extent also this element is developed in the report. If you can elaborate on this aspect.
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. So I think the message is, how do we channel finance and assistance to the most vulnerable groups, considering the equity considerations that you've mentioned. So more than half, or 57% of standalone adaptation communications, acknowledge that adaptive capacity and vulnerability differs across some of the vulnerable groups, particularly gender, age, urban factor and abilities, racial and occupation lines. But just 1/3 of actions were explicitly reported to be specifically targeting vulnerable groups. Those that did primarily focused on farmers. So 46% of adaptation communications acknowledged that farmers are being reached. Others kind of talked about other target groups like women and fisher folks. It's about 14%. And if you look at this distribution, we basically find that vulnerable groups are benefiting from adaptation actions, but they're not being reported on. And when we factor in the equity consideration, the majority of the underscore, when you look at the vulnerable groups overall, we need to break this down, particularly in terms of gender, in terms of different abilities, etc. And this would help better target the more vulnerable groups. So we need this kind of information on adaptation outcomes to target adaptation efforts and also to reach to the most vulnerable groups, considering the different equity dimensions.
Thank you. Probably one last final question before I also give the floor to Lucila. The UN Secretary General, when referring to the Adaptation Gap Report in the launch last year, he referred to the fact that we are in an adaptation emergency. And among the different points that he raised, he noted that the fossil fuel industry must support those suffering, and states must tax their profits. You refer to the importance of positive externalities for non-state actors, and also negative externalities, of course, in terms of taxation. So how is this addressed in this report? To what extent is it addressed as well?
Sure. So I did talk about in terms of financing, or finding innovative ways of financing, and the Secretary General has been quite clear, even through the outcomes of the COP28, that there is an end to the fossil fuel industry, particularly polluters taking that responsibility. He has definitely called on governments on the taxing tax the windfall profits of the fossil fuel industry and develop some of those funds, and being able to devolve these funds to countries suffering losses and damage in the face of climate crisis. So I think another message from the ESG, from the Adaptation Gap Report, is that first of all, we need to accelerate efforts in terms of reducing emissions. Second, in terms of finding innovative ways of channeling finance. One of the key ways, or one of the ways we could look at is by taxing the windfall profits of fossil fuel countries, and then using this as a possible way to finance and address loss and damage. Definitely, in the words of the Secretary General, we are in adaptation emergency. We have to act now, and we have to take steps in very innovative ways to close these adaptation gaps.
Thank you, Dr. Chandra. I will now give the floor to Lucila, because she may have further questions for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ginevra. Thank you, Dr. Alvin. Thank you for being with us, for presenting, for discussing, for being open to do a deep dive into the report, which actually I found extremely interesting. And I like actually that Ginevra started up speaking about the adaptation part of the report, because I would like to focus on the found and damage, on the loss and damage part, which I think, I guess also the audience consider this was, I would say, a topic that was most discussed in the last COP, and many of our audience in general would be very interested. And one part of the report, I thought it was quite curious, as I mean, we are, like, both Ginevra and I are lawyers, so I think we have a bias on the way that we're raising questions. But it definitely my question, you will see this, because the report is very good in addressing the difficulties of and two difficulties. One of the difficulties of once you have a loss and damage found, and we're dealing with loss conditions coming from climate, is first of all, it's to divide and identify an economic and non-economic loss. And the report, I think the report is very take the correct approach and said, when you're speaking about loss and when you're speaking about recovering of this loss, you cannot only address economic, but non-economic. And of course, the difficulties of defining non-economic are very complex, the boundaries of non-economic. And the another one, it's the avoidable and non-avoidable damages, distinguish when you were dealing with a loss that could be avoidable, either through mitigation or adaptation, and the ones that is not avoidable. And it was, while I was reading, it comes to my mind as to what extent you would have in the debate as well, discussions about the causality. Okay? To what extent do you have do you face issues in which causality is a question? To what extent, how to define it, that a specific loss, if it is a raising of the sea levels, or the heating, or desertification, whether there is questions, or what extent we rely on scientific evidence to identify that loss was caused by climate issues.
I do appreciate the question, and I'm a climate scientist. I will, answer this from a scientific perspective. I think from IPCC, from the confidence level that has been placed in terms of the human-induced nature of climate change, it's on the higher percentile, with very high confidence. The signal from the scientific community is that we already live in a changed climate. So whether or not, an impact is development related or it's climate related, attribution science has moved far beyond that and basically says that we live in a changed climate. Almost every impact, can be attributed to a climate event. And that these climate events then are related to anthropogenic or human-induced impacts. I do understand from a vast amount of research that has been done, there is a conceptual lack of clarity in terms of the types of losses and damages, and I think we talk about this in chapter 5 of the loss and damage. There's a broad typology of responsible for both economic and non-economic losses and damages. And the thing is that we must respect the country ownership and be equitable, inclusive, accessible, and adequate in terms of, when we are trying to classify the types of losses. I just got out of a conversation with one of the member states that was talking about communities wanting or having to relocate now. And one of the things that the island nations face in this context is that the close relationship that people have, local communities have with their land, with nature, and the environment. And due to this connection, it's very hard for local communities to move. And they're the full brunt, particularly smaller and developing states, they're the full brunt of climate impacts. And the non-economic dimensions of these loss and damage is quite important to consider. The cultural ties, the linkages with land. I come from Fiji, and we have a very close relationship with nature and with land, and our Vanuatu determines our identity. Once we are moved, that identity is lost. How do you quantify this? So I think it's quite important to consider these and respect the different ownership of countries and be equitable in terms of how we classify these different types of losses and damage. But to answer your question, we live in a changed climate. The scientific evidence is fairly clear in terms of attribution that almost every event is climate driven now.
Fantastic. It's very curious because when we discuss of loss and damage, this is a clear difference between we have a loss and damage fund, which is definitely unquestionable, fundamentally important right now, and what we have seen on climate change litigation, because there is a liability side, and here the causality it's end up being a barrier for reaching justice. So, which just reinforces the importance of loss and damage fund as Wade is stated as an intergovernmental institution. And I would like, and beside this, there was another thing as well in the report. I mean, I have like many interesting points on the report actually, in which there is reference that that from the 41 NAPs that has been delivered has been submitted to NFCCC until 1st of March. 49% actually makes reference to loss and damage, and with some limitations about the references. Vagueness, most likely, are not more defining what is expectable, how much money would be allocated to recover the losses, and so on. So if you, as a United Nations, if you would come to a country and as an advisor and say what you could expect it, an NAP would have it as a loss and damage element in that document, what you would expect it to him, the optimal model for a country to adopt the loss and damage at the national, regional, and local level, what you would expect it to have in this document?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. Of course, every country's circumstances differs, and so do the needs in relation to addressing climate impacts, risks, vulnerability, but also the emerging losses and damage. What we are seeing from countries at the front line of climate impacts is that we are reaching hard limits to adaptation. And when I say hard limits to adaptation, this is where under any feasible climate scenario, adaptation options will not yield a reduction in impact, risks, and vulnerability. So what we are looking at are basically now the intolerable risks that are beyond adaptation, that cannot be avoided as a result of adaptation actions, and this is basically the loss and damage dimension. So the unavoidable impacts of climate change, despite the fact adaptation could happen or would happen because of the hard limits. So I think in terms, I feel that this is a key consideration. when considering how finance is channeled. And if you look at the decision text that came out of COP28, I was supporting the transitional committee as part of a technical support unit in terms of the design of the fund and new funding arrangements. What is quite important is that countries do want that all, particularly all developing countries, to directly access resources from the fund, including that at the subnational, national, through all regional entities. They can be through modalities of small grant funding for communities, or policies or mechanisms that can be established by the new board of the fund. So it's quite important that the direct access is there. What I've also heard from countries is that the preference would be that this access to funds are in form of grants and not other instruments. If they are in forms of loans, then they are highly concessional. That's quite important. That is there. And going forward, of course, the board would be quite useful in further defining the scope access of the fund. Ideally, I think the needs of the country would be quite important. They should take the center charge in terms of channeling climate finance, particularly loss and damage finance. Sorry.
Thank you so much. When you mention about directed access, what do you mean, like local direct access of the local communities to the fund, or the governmental institutions as a request, as intermediary?
Yeah. So when I talk about when countries talk about direct access, they talk about budget support through national governments or in partnership with entities that safeguards that still have safeguards and standards in place. So direct access to subnational entities, small to communities, community-based organizations, basically, that channels fund and finance to the lowest level and to the most vulnerable communities. Direct access could also be in form of direct engagement with national counterparts and subnational counterparts. So facilities like small grant scheme that is more accessible to institutions and stakeholders, particularly community-based organizations.
Mm-hmm. Okay, fantastic. Carol, I would hand to you.
Yeah, I just have one question before Geneva, brings it all together. Now, in the conceptualization of loss and damage, and this will tie into maybe the discussion you just had with Lucila, there is the categorization that slow onset events as well as extreme events happen in isolation, which is not true, because clearly the report describes how these two do not happen in isolation. One could be the consequence of another. I just want to understand from your perspective, how do you see the loss and damage fund evolving, given that we are witnessing more and more extreme events that then would, of course, have a higher impact on the most vulnerable, which I think is quite clear that the fund needs to be disbursed to those who need it the most, right? And how do you see that fund evolving to cater to those extreme events, which are not isolated from the slow, onset events?
Yeah, so the purpose of the new fund and new funding arrangement is really to help address risks, impacts, losses, and damages resulting from both extreme and also slow onset events and this is quite important in the context of ongoing and ex-post action. No? And definitely what we are seeing now is that sudden and slow onset events can have quite a lot of interactions, particularly when we're looking at back-to-back or compound impacts that can then cascade risks. They can magnify both economic and non-economic losses and damages. So this is quite important. So in terms of how the fund would evolve to address this spectrum of different types of losses and damages, is that it would be quite important to have different modalities to support the different types of let's say what do you call the climate related losses and damage. So, particularly for slow onset events, you could look at programming, something like sea level rise. But for extreme events, you would need a very different modality, for example, a rapid disbursement modality. And the governing instrument did build into it different modalities to facilitate access of the fund. The fund would also need to develop very simplified procedures and criteria to fast track the screening to determine, to mobilize funds. And this would be quite crucial in terms of the access of funds. So in the case of, something like a rapid event, a very fast track procedure would be needed to mobilize funds to local communities so that they benefit, so that they can benefit. So the access modalities would be quite important overall, and there would be different types of triggers, and these modalities would be needed for slow onset and extreme events.
Thank you, Dr. Chandra, for your answers. So given that a few minutes left before we enter into the Q&A part, also to give the audience some space for their questions. Perhaps I will briefly wrap up the conversation that we had just had. Well, the science first is rather clear. The temperature levels are increasing, and in turn also the harm to the environment. So in a critical decade, however, the adaptation and the progress on climate adaptation is slowing. And the title of the Adaptation Gap Report is rather clear, underfinanced and underprepared. So in fact, finance needs are higher, and it is essential to find innovative ways to deliver finance, also to cover and reduce the adaptation finance gap. In turn, also as a result, the climate-related loss and damages are increasing. At last year's COP, we had an important outcome, an historical outcome, that was the adoption of the Loss and Damage Fund in supporting countries. Still, this will be a test year, and the following ones will also show the success of this fund. And so certain challenges still remain in terms of implementation, especially for vulnerable countries. So thank you for engaging with our questions, Dr. Chandra. And I now give the floor to Carol for to move on towards the Q&A section.
Thank you so much, Alvin, for this amazing presentation and answering our questions. And thank you, Professor Molly, for being a wonderful discussant, and Dr. Lucille as well. Our participants who joined us today have some questions, and we encourage you to please type in your question in the Q&A. So far, we have a question from Chris Haas. So what I'll do is I'll read it as is to avoid losing the context. Chris says that thank you for raising this important topic. The numbers are huge and dwarf the current official flows for climate adaptation, less than $50 billion. The Loss and Damage Fund, the current commitment by the North, is a few % of what is needed. I do not see this being increased by an order of magnitude. The implication is that much of the adaptation required will have come from national to local sources. Some investment is needed to adapt current agricultural practices, etc. However, much of the investment will be public sector investment to adapt urban environments. So he's asking, do you agree that this is the best way to mobilize both local and private sector resources to cater for these challenges. So Alvin, I'll hand over to you. I hope you can see the question in the Q&A as well.
Yes, this is a very interesting question, and particularly bringing into focus two things. One, which is the more adaptation we do, the less loss and damage we would have to deal with now. Unfortunately, for some geographies, those limits, the hard limits, particularly to adaptation, are approaching, and we are looking at unavoidable impacts. So the thing is, more adaptation we do, the less we would have to deal with in terms of loss and damage. And the second bit of this question is around city-based adaptation. That's a really good point, in terms of different sectors and systems where adaptation can be scaled up very, very quickly. At UNEP, we have a storehouse of very different types of adaptation actions that have taken place in city-based environments, from cooling measures, restoration, watershed restoration, for example, in Mexico, to vulnerability assessment in cities in Jamaica that has helped with urban planning, to El Salvador, where cooperatives have been set up in peri-urban areas for women to take on agriculture. And of course, last year's Adaptation Gap Report did include a couple of cases that provided how adaptation takes place in different sectors and systems. One of the interesting cases was that of I remember it was from Honduras, and San Pedro Sula, which is the largest economic center in Honduras. And some of the adaptation measures that they have taken through the project is through revegetation, refurbishing collectors, ecological restoration. And these actions in San Pedro have avoided an estimated 50 million in direct economic damages. They have protected over 30,000 people over the last, or will protect over 30,000 people over the next 3 decades. So, these kind of particularly restoration measures can have very positive spin-offs on the economy and livelihoods. So that's quite important in terms of thinking of adaptation in cities, human settlements, and also looking at innovative ways of channeling finance. And the question talks about private sector finance. One of the case studies that was included in the Adaptation Gap Report was that of the Private Financing Advisory Network, where small amounts of public finance was used to leverage large amounts of private sector investment for clean energy, for climate resilience project in low and middle income countries. So definitely a huge potential in terms of leveraging private sector investment, but also private sector opportunities to progress on adaptation as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alvin. We have a second question from Omonigo Eriga. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. What role can the voluntary carbon market play in supporting climate adaptation action? So I think this ties back into adaptation, and is the voluntary carbon market have a role? Does it have a role to play in adaptation?
Sure. So as we know, one of the architectures of the Adaptation Fund is where the carbon proceeds from carbon market provides a incentive for adaptation in the broad Adaptation Fund architecture. I do, broadly speaking, many mitigation options, particularly restoration, regeneration of forests, agriculture, for example, agroforestry, they do have very strong adaptation core benefits. And this is where a large amount of investments could happen. High adaptation, high mitigation options, which could have a very positive core benefit in terms of increasing resilience, increasing livelihoods, improving food security. And this is where the voluntary carbon market could have a strong potential. But as we know, the carbon market is quite volatile. We would need, in the longer term, in particularly looking at long-term planned adaptation, you would need more other instruments other than just carbon markets. And this is where tapping into private sector finance would be quite important. In the Adaptation Gap Report, we talk about the role of multilateral banks and investors and private sector that would be important in terms of mobilizing finance, and also in terms of the broader financial architecture, that the Bridgetown initiative that talks about, this would need a reform as well. So beyond just the voluntary carbon markets, domestic, international, private sector finance, and these innovative ways to deliver finance to increase adaptation would be quite important, and particularly that focusing on planned anticipatory adaptation that improves the effectiveness of adaptation actions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alvin, for the wonderful response. We appreciate it. I think we have a few more minutes. So I will ask if Geneva and Lucila have any closing remarks before we have the announcement section at the end. So Geneva?
No, it's okay. Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Lucila?
Yes, I have actually just to say thanks, Alvin, I think there is a lot to discuss. 1 hour, definitely, it's not worth. It's not fair for the work that UNEP has done only in this reporting. For that, we are not even speaking all the works and efforts that has been conducted in terms of this. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having UNEP in this discussion, and we truly appreciate this.
It was very exciting, and we are very grateful for you accepting our invitation to have this discussion, and we hope to have more discussions in the future on this topic, as well as whatever upcoming topics around the Adaptation Gap Report, as well as the Loss and Damage Fund, because it's important for us to continue looking at the evolution of the fund and to see how the modalities around access take place. So a very exciting topic and a very exciting time. So thank you all for attending today. Thank you, Professor Geneva. Thank you, Alvin. Thank you, Dr. Lucila. And thank you all our participants for joining us today and for your questions that I believe have been answered. We do have one more, but oh yes, thank you, Kara, for joining us. Thank you so much. We do have another series coming up next month. Please watch out at on the EUI events page, as well as the Florence School of Regulation events page for the next topic on the next FSR talk. We have one announcement to make just before we close the session. I will share with you, I think, Baptiste, if you're on the call, please share with us the final announcement for the day before we call it a day.
Share the link in the chat.
Thank you. So we have the African School of Regulation's flagship course, the Power Sector Regulation in Africa, that is being launched on the 8th of April 2024. There is a link in the chat to assist with registration of this course. Please join us to understand more about regulation of the power sector in Africa. We have very interesting instructors who will take you through the course. It's a 10-week course with a 1-week residential in Accra, Ghana. So once again, thank you all for joining us today, and we wish you a lovely week and a good rest of the day. Have a good evening. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.